Good evening. We begin tonight with breaking developments out of the west side of the city where federal agents have descended on an 8-bedroom hillside estate. This is the same property linked to a high-stakes financial probe that has dominated headlines for months. Within the last 2 hours.
FBI, search warrant. Open the door. FBI, we have a warrant.
What's happening?
Warrant, sir. Step to the side, please.
Clear.
Living room clear.
Kitchen clear. Office clear. What's going on? Why are you here?
The morning fog still clung to the hills of Calabasas when the first convoy of black SUVs began their ascent up the winding private road that led to the Mirage estate. It was 5:47 a.m. on a Thursday in late January, the kind of quiet hour when even the most dedicated content creators were still asleep, their ring lights dark, their cameras idle, their carefully curated personas set aside for the vulnerability of dreams. Special Agent Victoria Chen sat in the lead vehicle, reviewing the operational briefing one final time on her tablet. The estate sprawled across 12 acres of prime Southern California real estate, purchased 3 years ago for $47 million by a 28-year-old man, whose face was recognized by more people than most world leaders. His name was Brandon Vance, known to his 89 million YouTube subscribers simply as BV, and he had built an empire on a formula that seemed almost alchemically simple. Surround yourself with beautiful women, create content that blurred the line between reality and performance, and watch the money pour in. The Mirage Content House, as it was known to the internet, had become one of the most successful creator collectives in history. At any given time, between 30 and 50 young women lived on the property, producing videos that ranged from pranks and challenges to vlogs and lifestyle content. They had their own channels, their own followings, their own revenue streams, all of which flowed through the management company that Brandon had established to oversee his growing roster of talent. On the surface, it looked like the dream that millions of aspiring influencers chased, a beautiful mansion in the hills, instant fame, the chance to turn your personality into a career. Young women from across the country and around the world applied by the thousands, submitting videos and photos and personal statements explaining why they deserved a spot in the house, why they would be the next breakout star, why Brandon Vance should choose them. What happened to the ones who were chosen was something else entirely. Victoria had been building this case for 14 months, ever since a young woman named Jessica Moreno had walked into the FBI's Los Angeles field office with a story that had seemed almost too horrific to believe. Jessica had been a Mirage resident for 8 months before she escaped, climbing over the estate's perimeter wall at 3 a.m., with nothing but the clothes on her back and a burner phone she had hidden from the staff who monitored every aspect of the residents' lives. Her account had been delivered in a monotone, the flat effect of someone who had dissociated from their own experiences in order to survive them. She described a system of control that would have been familiar to any cult researcher. The isolation from family and friends, the confiscation of personal documents and devices, the constant surveillance, the punishment for rule violations, the rewards for compliance. She described being forced to create content that grew progressively more explicit, the pressure escalating gradually enough that each new boundary seemed only slightly beyond the last. She described the private sessions with Brandon and his inner circle, the things that happened in rooms without cameras, the threats that kept everyone silent. And she described the other women, dozens of them, trapped in the same gilded cage, too afraid or too broken to seek help. Victoria had listened to Jessica's account with the professional composure she had developed over 18 years in law enforcement. But inside, she had felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel: rage. Pure, focused rage at the man who had built this machine, who had weaponized fame and aspiration to prey on young women who had done nothing wrong except dream of a different life. She had promised Jessica that she would stop him, that she would rescue the women still trapped in that house, that she would make Brandon Vance pay for every violation, every manipulation, every shattered dream. Today, she would keep that promise. The convoy reached the estate's main gate at 5:52 a.m. The security guard in the booth was still half asleep, his coffee growing cold beside him, completely unprepared for the wall of federal vehicles that suddenly filled his monitors. By the time he reached for his radio to alert the house, FBI agents had already surrounded his booth, weapons drawn, voices commanding him to step out with his hands visible. He complied without resistance, his face showing the particular confusion of someone whose reality was collapsing faster than he could process. FBI, we have a warrant to search these premises. Disable all security systems and open the gate. The guard fumbled with his controls, his hands shaking. The gate swung open and the convoy rolled through. The Mirage estate was even more impressive in person than it appeared in the countless videos filmed within its walls. The main house was a modernist masterpiece of glass and steel, designed to showcase both the views and the inhabitants. Surrounding it were guest houses, a recording studio, a gym, a spa, and what appeared from satellite imagery to be a small village of bungalows where the content creators lived. The pool was Olympic-sized, the gardens professionally manicured, the whole property designed to project an image of success that would make viewers want to be part of it. Victoria knew that image was a lie. Behind the beautiful facade was a prison, and the women inside were inmates who had been convinced that their captivity was their choice. The teams deployed with practiced efficiency. Alpha Team moved on the main house, where Brandon and his senior staff had their quarters. Bravo Team secured the perimeter, ensuring no one could escape. Charlie Team began the systematic clearing of the guest houses and bungalows, the delicate work of contacting frightened women who might not understand that rescue had arrived. Victoria led Alpha Team herself, climbing the marble steps to the main entrance with her weapon drawn. The door was unlocked, as she had expected. In a house full of people trained to believe they had nothing to hide, security was focused on keeping people in rather than keeping people out. The interior was as stunning as the exterior, a cathedral of contemporary design filled with art and furniture that probably cost more than most people earned in a decade. But Victoria's attention was focused on the staircase leading to the upper floors, where intelligence suggested Brandon's private quarters were located. They moved silently up the stairs, past framed photos of Brandon with celebrities and influencers, past awards and plaques celebrating his achievements, past all the trappings of a success built on exploitation. The master suite was at the end of a long hallway, behind double doors of polished wood. Victoria positioned her team and gave the signal. The doors burst open, agents flooding into the room with weapons raised. Brandon Vance was in bed, tangled in silk sheets, his famous face slack with sleep. Beside him were two young women, their eyes flying open with terror as armed strangers surrounded them. "Brandon Vance, FBI. You're under arrest. Don't move." Brandon's eyes opened, focused, processed. For a moment, Victoria saw something calculating behind them. The mind of a man who had talked his way out of countless situations trying to find an angle. Then the calculation faded, replaced by something that might have been resignation. "Can I at least put on pants?" "You can put on what we give you, hands where I can see them." They cuffed him on the bed, read him his rights while he sat there in his boxer shorts, his famous hair mussed, his famous face showing the first cracks of the charm that had built his empire. The two women were escorted from the room by female agents who spoke to them in soft, reassuring tones, explaining what was happening, promising that they were safe. Victoria allowed herself one moment of satisfaction as Brandon was led past her. Their eyes met, and she saw recognition in his, the understanding that his world was ending. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said, his voice carrying the confident dismissiveness that had served him so well in negotiations and confrontations. "My lawyers will have me out before lunch. This is harassment. Your lawyers can't help you where you're going." Victoria watched him being led down the stairs, his bare feet padding on the marble, his hands cuffed behind his back. 89 women, Brandon, 89 victims, that's a lot of counts." His face flickered, the first genuine emotion she had seen, fear. He hadn't known they knew about all of them. He had thought some secrets were still safe. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You will. We have plenty of time to discuss it." They loaded him into a federal vehicle, while the sun began to burn through the morning fog. The beautiful estate, with its gardens and pools and stunning views, was now a crime scene, every building being searched, every device being seized, every resident being interviewed by agents trained in working with trafficking victims. Victoria stood in the driveway, watching the organized chaos of a major operation unfolding around her. After 14 months of investigation, countless interviews, hundreds of pages of evidence compiled and analyzed, it was finally happening. But she knew the real work was just beginning. Arresting Brandon was the easy part. The hard part was helping the women he had damaged, untangling the web of manipulation and control he had spun, rebuilding the lives he had shattered. Her phone buzzed with a text from the team leader at the bungalows. 89 women confirmed on site, beginning individual interviews. Many appeared traumatized but cooperative. Medical teams on standby. 89 women, the same number Jessica had estimated, the number that had seemed almost impossible when she first heard it. 89 women who had come to this place seeking fame and found captivity instead. Victoria took a deep breath and headed toward the bungalows. The women needed to see a face, to hear a voice, to understand that their nightmare was over. The sun was fully up now, burning away the last of the fog, illuminating the estate in the harsh light of a new day. The cameras that had documented so much would now document something different. Not the curated fantasy of influencer life, but the ugly reality of what had been hidden behind it. The mirage was shattered, and the truth was finally coming to light. The interviews began within hours of the raid, conducted in a conference room at the FBI's Los Angeles field office that had been hastily converted into a victim services center. Social workers, victim advocates, and trauma-informed agents worked in shifts, speaking with each of the 89 women individually, documenting their experiences, beginning the long process of understanding exactly what had happened inside the Mirage estate. The stories that emerged were both consistent and devastating. The recruitment process had been sophisticated and predatory. Brandon's team had identified young women through social media looking for specific characteristics: ambition, photogenic appearance, some existing following but not enough to have leverage, financial instability that would make the offer of housing and income irresistible, and most importantly, distance from strong family or friend networks that might ask uncomfortable questions. Once selected, the women were brought to the estate with promises of a content career, a bedroom in one of the bungalows, a monthly stipend, and access to the professional equipment and production support needed to grow their channels. The contracts they signed were dense with legal language that few of them understood, clauses that gave Brandon's management company control over their content, their image, their social media accounts, even their ability to leave the property. The control began subtly. Phones were collected for security reasons and replaced with company devices that were monitored. Communication with family and friends was discouraged, then restricted, then effectively prohibited. The women were told that outside relationships were distractions, that success required total commitment, that the other residents were their family now. The content expectations escalated gradually. New residents started with innocent material, vlogs about life in the house, participation in group challenges, reaction videos and collaborations. But over weeks and months the pressure increased. The content became more suggestive, then explicitly sexual. Women who resisted were told they weren't team players, that their attitude was affecting the whole house, that maybe they weren't cut out for this after all. The threat of expulsion was wielded like a weapon. The women had given up their apartments, their jobs, their support networks. They had signed contracts that gave the company control over content they had already created. Leaving meant starting over with nothing, possibly facing legal action for breach of contract, definitely facing the humiliation of public failure in an industry where reputation was everything. And behind all of this was Brandon himself, the charismatic center of the operation, who used his fame and power to extract whatever he wanted from the women under his control. Some of them described coerced sexual encounters. Others described being loaned to wealthy associates as entertainment. Still others described being filmed without consent in situations that were then used as leverage to ensure their compliance. It was a trafficking operation disguised as a content house, a modern slave system wrapped in the aesthetics of social media success. Victoria read through the interview summaries late into the night, each new account adding to the weight she carried. She had investigated trafficking before, had seen the techniques cartels and criminal organizations used to control their victims, but there was something uniquely insidious about what Brandon had built. the way he had used the legitimate structures of influencer culture to normalize exploitation, the way he had made his victims complicit in their own captivity by convincing them they were choosing it. The evidence seized from the estate only confirmed the interview accounts, servers containing thousands of hours of video, much of it explicitly sexual, much of it clearly filmed without the subject's knowledge or consent. Financial records showing the flow of money from advertising revenue and sponsorships through shell companies to offshore accounts. Communications between Brandon and his associates discussing the women as commodities, using dehumanizing language that revealed exactly how he saw the people in his care. And there was more. Evidence of payments to local officials who had looked the other way. Evidence of non-disclosure agreements backed by threats of legal and personal retaliation. Evidence of a private security team that had physically prevented women from leaving when they tried to escape. The scope of the operation was staggering. What had started as one man's predatory scheme had grown into a criminal enterprise worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a machine that chewed up young women and spat out content that millions of people consumed without any awareness of the suffering behind it. Victoria closed her laptop at 2 a.m., her eyes burning, her mind churning. Tomorrow, the preliminary hearings would begin. Tomorrow, Brandon Vance would face the cameras again, not as a beloved creator, but as an accused trafficker. Tomorrow, the world would begin to learn what had really been happening inside the beautiful house on the hill. She hoped they were ready for it. She wasn't sure she was. The arraignment of Brandon Vance took place 3 days after the raid, in a federal courtroom in downtown Los Angeles that had become the epicenter of media attention. Reporters from every major outlet crowded the hallways. Cameras tracked every arrival and departure. Social media buzzed with speculation and reaction from the millions of people who had followed Brandon's content without ever suspecting the darkness behind it. Inside the courtroom, Brandon appeared in an orange jumpsuit, his famous hair now limp and unwashed, his famous smile nowhere to be seen. He had been denied bail on the grounds that he was a flight risk with substantial international resources, and the 72 hours in federal custody had already begun to erode the polished image he had cultivated for so long. The charges were read in a flat monotone by the clerk, each count landing like a hammer blow: sex trafficking, forced labor, production of illicit content, fraud, money laundering, witness intimidation, and dozens more. The list went on for nearly 15 minutes, a catalogue of exploitation that seemed almost too extensive to be real. Brandon pleaded not guilty to all charges, his attorney immediately launching into arguments about prosecutorial overreach, about the consensual nature of the relationships in question, about the constitutional implications of criminalizing adult content creation. It was a preview of the defense strategy to come: reframe the victims as willing participants, paint Brandon as a businessman being persecuted for unorthodox but legal practices, muddy the waters with questions about agency and choice. Victoria watched from the gallery, her face impassive, her mind cataloguing every word for later analysis. She knew this was only the beginning, that the trial would be long and brutal, that the defense would do everything possible to discredit the women who had found the courage to speak. But she also knew something else. The evidence was overwhelming. The videos, the financial records, the communications, the testimony of 89 women whose accounts corroborated each other in ways that couldn't be fabricated. Brandon's lawyers could spin whatever narrative they wanted. The truth was documented in terabytes of data that no amount of rhetoric could erase. After the arraignment, Victoria held a brief press conference outside the courthouse. She stood before a forest of microphones, the California sun harsh on her face, and delivered a statement she had crafted with care. Today, Brandon Vance was arraigned on federal charges related to the exploitation of 89 women at his Calabasas estate. These women came to that property seeking opportunity and found captivity instead. They were isolated, controlled, coerced, and abused by a man who used his fame and wealth to prey on their dreams. She paused, letting the words sink in. The FBI is committed to pursuing justice for every one of these victims. We are also committed to investigating any individuals or organizations that enabled Mr. Vance's criminal enterprise. including those who may have participated in the exploitation, those who may have profited from it, and those in positions of authority who may have turned a blind eye. To the survivors, you showed extraordinary courage in coming forward. You are not alone, you are not to blame, and you will have the full support of federal law enforcement as we work to hold your abuser accountable. She took a few questions, deflected others, and retreated into the courthouse before the media frenzy could consume her entirely. There was too much work to do for her to spend the day being interviewed. In the weeks that followed, the investigation expanded in ways that shocked even Victoria's experienced team. The financial forensics revealed a network of investors and partners who had known exactly what was happening at the Mirage estate and had participated enthusiastically. Wealthy men had paid for private experiences with the residents. Corporations had sponsored content produced under coercive conditions. Other influencers had collaborated with Brandon while ignoring obvious signs of abuse. The scope of complicity was enormous. It suggested something disturbing about the industry Brandon had operated in, about the willingness of people to overlook exploitation when it was packaged attractively, about the moral blindness that money and fame could induce. 14 additional arrests were made in the month following the raid. Brandon's head of security, who had personally prevented women from leaving. His chief financial officer, who had structured the money laundering operations. Several investors who had participated in the private sessions. A local politician who had received campaign contributions in exchange for ensuring that complaints were never investigated. Each arrest peeled back another layer of the operation, revealed another node in the network of exploitation. It was like pulling a thread that unraveled an entire garment, exposing the corruption underneath what had appeared to be legitimate business. And through it all, the survivors began the long process of healing. The FBI worked with victim services organizations to provide housing, counseling, legal support, and medical care for each of the 89 women. Many of them had nowhere to go, their connections to family and friends severed by years of isolation. Many of them struggled with the psychological aftermath of their experiences, the complex trauma of having been manipulated by someone they had trusted, the shame and self-doubt that predators deliberately cultivate in their victims. Jessica Moreno, the woman who had first come forward, became an informal leader among the survivors. She had spent the months since her escape rebuilding her life, going to therapy, reconnecting with the family she had been forced to abandon. Now she channeled her experience into supporting others who were just beginning the journey she had already traveled. "The hardest part is believing that you didn't choose it," she told Victoria during one of their conversations. "Brandon was so good at making us feel like everything was our decision, like we wanted to be there, wanted to do those things, wanted to stay even when part of us was screaming to run. Undoing that takes time, it takes work. It takes people who believe you when you're not sure you believe yourself." Victoria listened, as she had listened to so many survivors over the years, humbled by their resilience, angered by their suffering, determined to ensure that their voices would be heard. "You started this," she said. "You walked into our office and told your story when it would have been easier to stay silent. Because of you, 88 other women are free today." Jessica shook her head. "They freed themselves, I just showed them the door." The trial of Brandon Vance began 8 months after his arrest in a proceeding that would stretch across 4 months and become one of the most watched criminal cases in American history. The courtroom was a theater of American justice, with all its grandeur and all its flaws, where the fate of one man would be decided by 12 ordinary citizens who had probably never imagined they would be weighing evidence of the crimes alleged. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented the documentary evidence, the videos, the financial records, the communications that revealed Brandon's contempt for the women he controlled. They presented expert testimony on trauma, on trafficking, on the techniques predators use to establish and maintain control. And they presented the survivors themselves, one after another, taking the stand to describe their experiences in their own words. Victoria watched each survivor's testimony with a mixture of pride and pain. These women had been broken by Brandon Vance, had been convinced that they were worthless except as content and commodities. Now they sat in a federal courtroom, facing their abuser, telling the world what he had done to them. It was an act of courage that Victoria never stopped admiring, no matter how many times she witnessed it. The defense did what defense attorneys always do in trafficking cases. They tried to reframe the narrative. They argued that the women were willing participants in a business arrangement, that they had signed contracts, that they had benefited financially from their time at the estate. They suggested that the prosecution was criminalizing unconventional lifestyle choices, that the survivors were rewriting history to portray themselves as victims rather than entrepreneurs. It was an ugly strategy, one that forced the survivors to relive their trauma while being called liars and opportunists. But Victoria had prepared them for it, had warned them that the defense would try to make them feel small and stupid and complicit. She had told them to tell their truth and trust that the jury would see through the manipulation. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Brandon himself took the stand. His attorneys had advised against it, but his ego wouldn't allow him to remain silent while others defined his story. He took the oath and began to speak, deploying the charm that had made him famous, explaining his side of events with the smooth confidence of a man who had talked his way out of trouble his entire life. The prosecutor, a veteran named Elena Rodriguez, who had spent 20 years putting predators behind bars, waited patiently through his direct examination. Then she began her cross. "Mr. Vance, you've described the Mirage Content House as a business opportunity for aspiring creators. Is that accurate?" "Absolutely. I gave those women a chance to build their brands, develop their skills, reach audiences they never could have reached on their own. And in exchange, they signed contracts giving your company control over their content, their social media accounts, and their ability to leave the property. Standard industry contracts. Anyone in this business would recognize them. These standard contracts also gave you control over their personal communications. Is that right? Their phones, their emails, their contact with family?" Brandon shifted slightly. "We had to protect proprietary information. That's normal in any business. And when women wanted to leave, they were physically prevented from doing so by your security team." "That's not accurate. Some women were confused or making emotional decisions. We encouraged them to think carefully before throwing away their opportunities." "Encourage them." Eleanor picked up a document from her table. "I'm going to read from an email you sent to your head of security on March 15th of last year. Quote, Madison is talking about leaving again. Make sure she understands what happens to people who break their contracts. She's got good numbers right now, and I'm not losing that revenue." End quote. "Is that your email, Mr. Vance?" Brandon's composure flickered. "That's taken out of context. What context would make threatening a young woman acceptable business practice?" "I wasn't threatening her. I was asking my team to explain her contractual obligations." With a security team that included former military personnel and individuals with criminal records for assault, the questions continued for 3 days, Eleanor methodically dismantling every excuse, every rationalization, every attempt to reframe exploitation as opportunity. By the end, Brandon's famous charm had curdled into something petulant and desperate, his smooth explanations replaced by hostile deflections that revealed the contempt he felt for anyone who challenged him. The jury deliberated for 6 days. When they returned, the foreman's hands were steady as he read the verdicts. Guilty. On count after count after count, guilty. Sex trafficking, guilty. Forced labor, guilty. Production of illicit content, guilty. Money laundering, guilty. Witness intimidation, guilty. Brandon showed no reaction as the verdicts were read, his face a mask of practiced indifference. But Victoria saw his hands trembling where they rested on the defense table, saw the slight tremor in his jaw as the full weight of what was happening began to settle on him. The sentencing hearing took place 2 months later. Survivors submitted impact statements describing the long-term effects of their experiences, the nightmares, the difficulty trusting others, the shame that followed them even though they had done nothing wrong. Family members spoke about watching their daughters and sisters disappear into the mirage and emerge years later as shadows of who they had been. Brandon's attorneys asked for leniency, citing his youth, his lack of prior criminal record, his potential for rehabilitation. They presented letters from supporters who still believed in his innocence, who blamed the survivors for their own exploitation, who saw the prosecution as an attack on the content creation industry. Judge Patricia Hawkins, a former prosecutor herself who had spent her career fighting for victims of exploitation, was unmoved. "Mr. Vance," she said from the bench, "you built an empire on the destruction of young women's lives. You used your fame and your wealth to lure them into a system designed to strip them of their autonomy, their dignity, and their humanity. You treated them as content rather than as people, as commodities to be monetized rather than individuals with rights and dreams and futures." She paused, her gaze cold and unforgiving. "The law provides a range of sentences for the crimes of which you've been convicted. I am imposing the maximum on every count to run consecutively. You are sentenced to 127 years in federal prison. You will die behind bars, Mr. Vance, and even that is less than you deserve." 127 years. The number echoed through the courtroom, through the media coverage, through the social platforms where millions of people were watching. It was effectively a death sentence, a guarantee that Brandon Vance would never again walk free, never again have the opportunity to prey on young women seeking fame and finding captivity instead. Victoria sat in the gallery as the sentence was read, feeling something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was close to it. Justice had been served, as much as justice could ever be served when the harm was so profound and so widespread. Brandon would be punished, his victims would have closure, the world would know what had happened behind the beautiful walls of the Mirage estate. But she also knew that justice wasn't enough. The systems that had enabled Brandon still existed. The culture that had looked the other way while he exploited women still thrived. The dream of influencer fame that he had weaponized still lured young people into situations they didn't understand. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. But today was a victory, and Victoria allowed herself to feel it. Outside the courthouse, she gave one final statement to the media. Today, Brandon Vance received the sentence he deserves for his crimes against 89 women. But this case is about more than one predator. It's about an industry that enabled him, about platforms that profited from exploitation, about a culture that values content over humanity. We must do better. We must protect the vulnerable. We must ensure that the dream of creative success never again becomes a nightmare of abuse. She paused, looking directly into the cameras. To the survivors of the Mirage estate, you are not content. You are not commodities. You are human beings of infinite worth, and your courage has changed the world. Thank you for trusting us with your stories. Thank you for standing up when it would have been easier to stay silent. This victory belongs to you. She walked away from the microphones, away from the courthouse, away from the case that had consumed her life for nearly 2 years. There would be appeals to fight, civil suits to support, policy reforms to advocate for. There would be other cases, other predators, other victims who needed someone to fight for them. But today she had kept her promise. Jessica Moreno had walked into her office with a story of horror, and Victoria had listened, had believed, had acted. 89 women were free today because of that choice. It wasn't everything, but it was something, and sometimes something was enough. The years that followed the trial brought changes both expected and surprising. The Mirage estate was seized by the federal government and eventually sold, the proceeds distributed among the survivors as partial restitution. The beautiful house on the hill was demolished by its new owners, who built something different in its place. A retreat center for survivors of trafficking where they could heal in the same hills where they had once been imprisoned. Jessica Moreno became an advocate, using her story to warn others about the dangers hidden behind the glamour of influencer culture. She wrote a memoir that became a bestseller, testified before Congress about the need for better regulation of content houses, and founded an organization that provided support to young people entering the industry. Victoria Chen retired from the FBI 5 years after the trial, her career defined by the Mirage case, but encompassing dozens of other investigations that had brought predators to justice. She wrote her own book, focusing on the techniques traffickers used and the ways institutions could better protect vulnerable people. She taught at the FBI Academy, passing her knowledge to the next generation of agents who would carry on the work. The content industry itself underwent significant changes. Platforms implemented new safeguards, requiring verification of consent for adult content, establishing reporting mechanisms for exploitation, partnering with law enforcement, to identify and remove trafficking operations. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was progress. And the survivors healed, slowly and incompletely, carrying scars that would never fully fade, but building lives that were their own. Some returned to content creation on their own terms, reclaiming the dreams that had been twisted by Brandon Vance. Others left the industry entirely, finding purpose in careers that had nothing to do with cameras and followers. A few struggled, unable to escape the trauma, lost to addiction or despair, or the simple inability to rebuild what had been destroyed. Victoria kept track of them all as best she could. She attended their weddings and graduations, sent cards on birthdays and anniversaries, maintained connections that had been forged in the worst circumstances and had somehow become sources of strength and meaning. On the 10th anniversary of the raid, she returned to Calabasas, to the hillside where the Mirage estate had once stood. The retreat center was hosting a reunion for survivors, a gathering of women who had shared an experience that no one else could fully understand. Jessica met her at the entrance, older now, her face showing the years, but also a piece that hadn't been there when they first met. "Thank you for coming," Jessica said. "It means a lot to have you here. I wouldn't miss it." They walked together through the grounds, past gardens and meditation spaces and rooms designed for healing, women clustered in small groups, laughing and crying and embracing, reconnecting with people they had once been afraid to trust. "Do you ever think about him?" Jessica asked. "Brandon?" Victoria considered the question. Brandon Vance had died in prison 3 years earlier, shanked by another inmate for reasons that were never fully explained. The news had reached her on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and she had felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not relief, not even the closure that some survivors had reported. "Not often. He's not worth the mental space. I used to think about him every day, every hour sometimes. What he did to me, what he made me do, how he made me feel. But lately I realize days go by without him crossing my mind, weeks sometimes. It's like he's shrinking, becoming less and less significant until eventually he'll just be a small dark spot in my past instead of the thing that defines me. That's healing. I guess it is." Jessica looked out at the gathering of survivors, at the women who had found their way back to themselves. "We're not what happened to us. We're what we did with it afterward. That's what I've learned." Victoria nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle into her. She had spent her career fighting predators, trying to protect the vulnerable, seeking justice for those who had been harmed. It was necessary work, important work, work that she would never regret. But the real victory wasn't in the courtrooms or the prisons. It was here, in this garden, among these women who had survived the unsurvivable and were now living lives of their own choosing. It was in the healing. It was in the rebuilding. It was in the stubborn human capacity to find light even in the darkest places. Victoria stayed at the reunion until evening, listening to stories, sharing memories, honoring the journey that had brought them all to this moment. When she finally left, driving down the winding road as the sun set over the hills, she felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel: hope. The world was full of predators. The world was full of darkness. But it was also full of survivors, full of fighters, full of people who refused to let the darkness win. And as long as that was true, there was reason to keep fighting. She drove into the sunset, toward whatever came next, carrying with her the knowledge that she had made a difference. It wasn't everything, but it was enough.